Well, good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jim Zengel. I'm a third-generation builder. My family's been building in the Dayton area since 1928. We've also developed land, and as probably a lot of you have, I'm now a remodeler. I started codes work in the early 90s with a couple of people in this room when we had a local code committee here that was relevant. Started working statewide for Ohio home builders in the late 90s, and in the early 2000s I started working code-wise for the National Association of Home Builders. I served 6 years on the RCAC, which creates the statewide building code, and I've worked at NHB on their construction codes and standards committee for about 10 years, and I've twice served on 2 code development committees for the ICC. I've also presented some energy code updates at the IBS. Having said all that, I know a lot about codes. I don't know everything about codes. Anything I say, if you go to an official and say, well, Jim Zengel said this, it really won't get you very far. But the presentation today is what we're going to try to do is go through the changes to the code from what we were used to using, which was variations of a couple of different codes, which I'll go here in a minute. There's no formal handouts or PowerPoint presentation. We won't have time to go into minutia of the code. I'm going to try to just briefly hit a lot of the changes, go all through the code. For those who may have attended the seminar a couple weeks ago where the Board of Building Standards put on, which is Chapter 3, it's not going to be anything like that. We're going to try to go through what I consider major changes to the whole building code. So we won't be able to ask a whole lot of questions possibly. We can do some as they go through there, but if we get bogged down, I'll just move on. I did this a couple weeks ago, and so you're my second group that I've done this, so hopefully it starts to gel together here a little bit. But as for just a brief idea, OBOA last published a bill, well, I guess go from there. Before where we are in codes, there was the Ohio Building Officials Association used to create a code, and it was referred to as the OBOA code. They adopted the CABO code, which was a bunch of building officials there was 3 different code bodies that created the building code prior to like the early 2000s, late 1990s. OBOA used to take that code, the CABO code, and create a statewide code. It was not enforced by anybody. It was basically just a suggestion that cities and townships could use for their code. If I'm assuming most of us are in Montgomery County, Greene County, all this kind of area around here, we pretty much, everybody worked off of that code. All the local jurisdictions adopted that. They would enforce it differently, though. They had their own ideas on what was right and what was wrong. And for those that built in a lot of different areas, you know the thrill that was. In 2005, House Bill 175 created a statewide code. And the rule of that is if you enforced a building code, you could only enforce one code. This code was created by a group called the RCAC, with the Residential Code Advisory Committee. It is the only building code that is enforceable in the state of Ohio. It's based on the last version of the OBOA code, which was a 2003, and then also the 2003 IRC. The committee, of which I was a member of it at the time, we formed those 2 documents together to come up with the Residential Code of Ohio version 2006, which is what we've been using for the last, however well, since 2006. The new version of the building code that we are going to adopt on January 1st is based off of the 2009 version of the IRC. We actually started to work on that code at the very end of 2009, and it was kind of finished in the middle of, we were 12, the middle of 11, and through a lot of different things that go on politically and just legislatively, how everything fits together, it's going to take effect January 1. So we're working on a, if I get kind of confused or say things that, say I don't really know, we're enforcing a code that was written for 2009. The 2012 version came out this year, and in the code groups, we're working on creating the 2015 version of the IRC, of which I'm working with the National on some of those things. So sometimes it gets very difficult to figure out where you are, where you've been. I will try to make this very quick, depending on your knowledge. Some may seem like big changes, some will be just small changes. I will try to just reference sections, chapters. One thing, anytime like we're adopting a new code, and when you start to work with your code officials, things may look like they're brand new, but they've really been in the code for a long time. It's just that nobody enforced them, or they enforced them differently. So a lot of times it can get a little bit strange, problematic. A lot of interpretations that people have been using and say, oh, that language is the same, but the interpretation's changed over time. And code officials, when they start to look this over, they say, oh, we were reading that wrong. We got to change that. So you're out there in the field and boom, you see this thing and you get turned down on inspection and you feel like, well, what was going on here? It's just an interpretation. And then some of the things were just never enforced, so you run into that. So with that in mind, a couple of things. We're going to start out in Chapter 1, just a few things in Chapter 1, and mainly Section 113, and mainly because in 113.4 there's a section called Additions and Alterations. And if you're doing a lot of remodeling work, it basically states that if you're adding a room onto a house, only that room that is added on has to be brought up to code. So sometimes you'll get all these different ideas of what needs to be changed or what doesn't. So that's a very good section to know. Portions of the structure that aren't altered aren't affected at all, and they shouldn't be required to change things. The other one that I'm going to point out in Chapter 1 is Section 114.2, which is Alternative Materials, Products, Assemblies, and Methods. This allows you to use a product at a manufacturer that you've seen. You're out on the internet, you go to the builder show or something like that, and you see something. A lot of them will have how to install it, directions, and some of them have been approved by the ICC, but they might not be in the code book, and your code official says, no, you can't use that. This allows the code official to read over this documentation that you give them, and they say, great, that's no problem, go ahead and use it. So, two good sections to use. I'm going to bring out some things in Chapter 3. I know maybe some of you were there last week or the week before and heard some of this, but at least what we heard, if you were at the Montgomery County things, a couple of things that were brought up, in my opinion, were wrong, and I say that for a couple of different reasons, but I'm not going to get into them. But I just want to bring up a few things. One thing that you're going to see, there's a lot of language in here that may change, or you see a big change, and it's just additions. Like right in the first one, in design criteria of things you can use to design your house, they've just added a section for SIPs, structural insulated panels. So some of the changes can be as small as that. One of the things that was brought up, at least in Montgomery County, I don't know if we kind of had a different conversation going on for if any of you went to Columbus to review the thing there, which I thought is section 301.2.1.4, which is the exposure category. They have 4 exposure categories, so if your house is sitting out in the middle of a farm field, you have to build the walls stronger to withstand wind than you do if it's in the middle of a subdivision. And it was stated that, well, the first house you build in a subdivision is going to have to be built by this wind standard, and that's completely wrong. It specifically states in the commentary, which is a book that I recommend everybody get the one based on the 2009 IRC, because that's what we're built on, but it specifically states in there is that the building is designed for what the subdivision will be built out. If you're in a subdivision, they fully understand that there's going to be a subdivision there. You don't have to do that. So make sure if somebody starts to try to get on you on that you look that up. One thing that's changed a little bit, there was attics with limited storage. This is in 301.5 on live loads. They now have a habitable attic and attic served with affixed stairs that you can go down, that you have to limited. Well, they have attics with storage is 10 pounds, attics with limited storage is 20 pounds, habitable attics and attics served with fixed stairs. Fixed stairs is not considered a pull down stairs. So just keep that in mind, because people say, "Oh, you got a staircase. You got to build up your trusses and everything to accept more load." Once again, it's stated right in the commentary of what those things do. One nice reduction is balconies. Used to have, this is in 301.5 on live loads again. Balconies used to have a 60 pounds per square foot live load. That's been reduced to 40 pounds. But they've also kind of changed the criteria of how far a balcony can stick out too. So it could be a catch-22. Can't build a 20-foot balcony. You know, they've reduced how far you can go through there. One thing that in section 302, it's fire-resistant construction. They used to have fire blocking, firewalls, fire separation, draft stopping, all spread out through different parts of the code, mainly in chapter 3. They've all combined anything in fire stopping, fire-resistant construction in one section in there, so it's kind of cohesive. You're going to see a lot of that in this code, where they kind of cleaned it up and try to combine things and just make things simpler to find when you need to. One quick thing in 308.4, hazardous locations. If you got a deck sticking out here and you've got ground, I think it's 30 inches, that you don't have to have a handrail. I think that's what it is. But now they've changed it so that 30 inches has to be measured 36 inches away from the deck. So that if you had or if you build like a little flower bed here and then it went like this, you didn't have to do anything. So you go 36 inches out and measure to what your ground level is. So they were afraid people were building them and putting a little flower bed there and say, well, it's only 30 inches, and get by with it. So another kind of part on kind of more for the remodeling. But it's in section 310 on emergency escape and rescue openings. If you do remodeling, if you change windows, it specifically states in here that you don't have to make the windows for the egress requirements that are for in new construction, where you have to have the windows so wide and so tall and so many square feet. Section 311, means of egress. You aren't going to find anything, this was an Ohio legacy type of thing, on the width of interior doors. We used to have a minimum 2'4" door for a bathroom. They had some different things in there, and I heard a lot of code officials crying over that, but it's how many people are putting that small of a door, or smaller than, I don't know how many 2-foot wide door openings people put in bathrooms. Maybe there's guys out there still doing it, so. Speaking of that, do we have any code officials here? If I speak badly, how many builders do we have? A lot of builders, remodelers, a couple remodelers, and I know there's some associates, I see some energy guys. So anybody that's not builder remodelers? I got a guy that sells me floor tile over there, so okay. So we got a little bit of everybody here, so. But that was removed. Anything on door widths and just different things, heights and those type of things. That's what used to be in 311, section 311 means of egress. One thing that was added in there is the emergency escape and egress windows for like if you have a basement. Let's say you have a partial basement, you put a deck over your emergency egress window. They've got specifications in there. As long as you have 36 inches between the bottom of your deck and the ground level, you can use that as a emergency egress window. So if you did or wanted to build a deck over one of the big windows for a basement bedroom, there's some provisions in there for doing that. 311.7.3, which gets into staircases. That's part of means of egress also, but walk line in if you do winder type of stairs, there's now provision that within 12 inches of the inside of your inside edge that you have to have. Is it 12 inches? Well, you have to be within 12 inches. You have to have be the required tread distance. In winders, it didn't used to have anything like that. One thing, and I'm not sure, this one really hit me, was 311.7.4, which stair treads and risers. I've always worked with my inspector in Miami Township with Montgomery County, where we measured the rise of the stairs after the carpet. We accounted for carpet. We just had an interpretation between us that my carpet was 3/4 of an inch. So that first stair was always going to be 3/4 of an inch low, and the top stair was going to be even with what it is if you were going to carpet. They have changed that. The stair dimension now is measured from the tread to tread. So there's no carpet taken into account there. It specifically says, stair treads and risers shall meet the requirements of this section. For the purposes of this section, all dimensions and dimension surfaces shall be exclusive of carpets, rugs, or runners. So we may have to, I'm assuming, let's say if you got a ceramic tile floor and a wood floor, you work it from there, but it's going to be something that we have to kind of work our way through. So for people buying stairs, right, and they're put in the rough stages of construction, you really have to figure out exactly what we're going to do on that, because I don't know how all that's going to fit together.
Did they keep the minimal variance of 3/8 of an inch top to bottom?
Yes, that didn't change. Yeah, the difference between one tread to the other, everything else is pretty much the same in there. One thing on guardrails, section 312, specifically 312.2, if you've got a deck, here's your deck, here's your railing here, and one thing we always do is put a seat right there. Now this seat has to be extended so your 36-inch height extends from the top of the seat, not from your 36 doesn't come from the deck. So if you put anything that's climbable up against that railing of the deck, that railing has to be increased. That doesn't say that you can't put your seat 6 inches away from that railing and be good, because there's nothing in there that states that, but you didn't. It's just, that's gonna be one of those things that if you try to skirt that issue, it's gonna be a little tricky, but we had a couple of conversations with that years ago. In smoke alarms, one thing that's changed a little bit now, if you have a whole house alarm system, they specifically mention in here that you can use that as your fire protection for your smoke alarm system. But it has to meet the same requirements of the code, meaning you have to have an alarm, a sensor in each bedroom, and outside of each bedroom. You can't just put one per floor. And you have to work out some special details if the homeowners decide to unhook it or do anything like that. There's some reading and writing and more paperwork to do, but probably the easiest thing to do is just keep putting in dual systems and be done with it. But if you so choose, you can do something different. Section 315, carbon monoxide alarms, that's brand new. It's been something that they've been fighting with for 10 or 12 years. There's still a lot of discussion, controversy over it as to exactly the best place to put it. There's nothing in the code tells you where you have to put it. It just basically states that each home has to have one. Or any home with either an attached garage or a fuel burning appliance in it. You're required to do it. It doesn't say it has to be electric with battery backup. It can be a plug-in model. As long as it's put in with the way the manufacturer of that particular alarm states that it's in the right location, you're okay. So,
Just one? Just
one installed in the outside of each separate sleeping area in the immediate vicinity of the bedrooms. So it's mainly in the bedroom area. It doesn't have to be on every floor. And once again, there's going to be a requirement if you're doing a remodel work, you're going to have one in there. And there's a UL section, the UL standard, UL 22034, that is that your smoke alarm has to meet. That's written in the code. So make sure whatever you buy at Lowe's, Home Depot, or your electrician supplies or whatever, that it meets that requirement.
What was that number?
UL 2034. Yeah, that's section 315. Section 317, protection of wood against wood-based products against decay. They've changed the standard in here of it used to be an AWPA, it was a C standard, now it's a U1. And that was brought up that it's a new standard, you got all this stuff. Well, that standard's been out since 1999, so most of our lumber companies have probably been selling their treated lumber to that standard already, so it's not a big deal. There was some conversations that there was some new language in there, but it's really the same on a lot of different things. The only language that I saw that really changed was if you have, they want sheathing, wall siding, framing on the exterior to be, or roofing, or even up against roofing material or anything, 2 inches away from any wet surface. So if your siding is on you got a foundation, and you have siding coming down, you're supposed to be 6 inches from, this is your ground here, foundation, and you've got some siding, lap siding, let's say, coming through there. You have to be 6 inches away from the ground. If by chance you've got the same thing over here, you can't like pour a concrete slab right up against that. There has to be a 2-inch space between there. So it might get you on front porches and those type of things. So. There was a lot of discussion on this section in here, thinking that this is one of those points that saying, well, this is new language and this is that and this is. this is, most of this, in this section, in this 317, it's been in the code. Some of it was combined, kind of like the wood protection, like when I said in fire separation and draft stopping, they combined some of the sections together. So it's just different looking, but it's the same language. It's been there for a while. 319, you now have to have your address in front of every job. So that's a whole new section. It's 4 sentences, but basically you gotta have the job site address on there. Storm shelters. There's a section in there how to build a storm shelter. I would just advise you, the ICC has created standards called ICC NSSA-500. It's the ICC 500. It specifically tells you how to build a storm shelter. What's concerned us, I guess, as this is going through, if you build a room in a house and you call it a safe room or whatever you want to call it, and a lawyer gets a hold of you and you didn't build it by any standard, you just say, well, I put concrete and steel rebar and everything like this in there, somebody could come back and possibly litigate you, I guess is a good way. You just be careful of what you call some of these rooms.
There is a publication by FEMA that also specifies and details a variety of different storm
Okay.
and safe rooms.
And you just have to be careful of how you do some of those things. The next thing in here, it's just, or it's the last section in chapter 3, 324. There's now post-frame accessory structures. So if you build a pole barn in your backyard or on different areas, there's prescriptive requirements to build that. So you wouldn't have to go, I guess a lot of, in Ohio and a lot of the jurisdictions and rural jurisdictions, the code officials were making some people just go through all kinds of hoops to build a basic pole barn. And this was actually done by OBOA, was added in there, and they met with the post-frame construction industry. There's an industry for everything, and they created this document together. If you exceed the size and width of these buildings, you want to put storage in the ceiling or whatever, you're going to have to go get a specific design done on it. But there are some simple designs or some prescriptive requirements that are in there now if you ever want to use that. So that's kind of what I consider the major things in chapter 3. Like I say, there's a few more here and there in there, but I'm trying to just hit the major ones just because of time constraints and also give us a little time for questions somewhere along the line. So any thoughts, processes on that? Okay. Section 4, footings. A lot of what you're going to see sometimes, why this book has gone, when I started in 1979, we could build a house with this little document now here. Of course, now this is the new code book right here. A lot of the stuff in here isn't any different than what was in here. The difference is because me as a builder had one way of doing it and the code official had a different idea of doing it, is they've added more language to eliminate some of those discussions, and they keep adding and adding. The other thing is there's different building systems that have been included in the code, and I'll kind of go through some of those. So some of it is they just elaborated, like one when we get to is wall bracing, if you look in there, it's like 3 pages. Now there's 40, 50 pages on how to brace a house to keep it from falling over, but we'll get into that. But you're going to see a lot of just different things like that added in here. There's now in section 4, 402.3, anybody who's using precast concrete, precast foundations, there's some prescriptive requirements in there on how you, what kind of concrete and how you use it. There's foundation anchorage is 403.1.6. This isn't really new language. I just like to point it out that sometimes, once again, code officials will look at this stuff in a new light and see different things. But every built, and say this because of an addition here, every bottom plate that you use in a house has to have 2 anchor bolts in it within, depending on how the size of your anchor bolt, within 12 inches of that end, 4.5 to 12 inches if you're using 1/2-inch anchor bolts from the end of the plate, which made it pretty difficult if you had a 12-inch wall. And you get, I mean, we've probably all been there, had to put 2 anchor bolts in a little offset that's 12 inch or 24 inches. They've added language in there, if it's 24 inches or less, you can get by with just 1 anchor bolt. If it's 12 inches or less, depending on how your braced wall line, which is kind of a new term that we'll get into, you don't have to put any anchor bolts in there. So they've kind of eased those restrictions a little bit. 404.1.2, it's mainly any concrete foundation walls, but it's any concrete that you could run into. ACI, which is the American Concrete Institute, has updated their standard 318, which has been around forever. But there's also an ACI 332 or a PCA 100. Point is a lot of these standards have been updated, which means they're going to change the requirements. They did it a couple of years ago, and what they thought was the amount of steel and anchor bolts, meaning the American Concrete Institute, that you needed in a foundation wall. Certain ways you could go building a house, you had to put like your anchor bolts 9 inches apart. I mean, it just, but they've since updated that a little bit, but the point is keep track of these standards in here as you're reading through them to make sure that either you or your people that are doing your work have seen the different standards or keep up to date on it. So everything on section 4, which was foundations. Floors is chapter 5. 502.2.1, deck ledger connection to a band board. They've actually prescriptive requirements, how to attach a deck to a house. There's a table that tells you how many anchor bolts you have to put, how far apart they are, where they are. Keep in mind that they don't really consider anchoring to brick as anchoring your deck to a wall. Brick is considered veneer, it's not structural or anything like that. So you're not going to find anything in this code to tell you how to do that because it's not there. The other thing is there's an alternative deck ledger connection for lateral loads. So if you got your wall and you got your deck attached to it, they don't want the deck to just pull off of the wall. They've got a prescriptive connection in here that you could probably hook up one of Larry Phillips' big loaders out here and pull the whole house over with it. It's probably way overkill, but it's prescriptive. It is not required, it's just a way to do it. So if you get a code official saying, well, this is what the book says, you got to do it this way, it is just an alternative. If your architect, designer has specific requirements of how to attach that to deal with the lateral loads, you don't have to do anything with it. Fire resistance of floors, it's been a huge issue. This is the one where it's section 502.14, 502.14. It's basically if you build a basement, use I-joists, the basement floor has to be, the floor joists have to be covered with drywall, or you have to use, well, there's some options coming out. Right now it basically says either use 2x10 or 2x12 solid sawn lumber, or you cover the floor with drywall. This requirement, there is no requirement that the drywall has to be taped. There's no requirement that it has to fit so tight against your walls and woodwork and ductwork. You don't have to cover your ductwork. They leave you 80 square feet around a furnace to put it in there. It is strictly to slow down the fire if it starts to burn. If any of you probably get on the internet and see it, an I-joist will burn through in 2 to 3 minutes if there's a fire underneath it. If you can shoot me later, but I'm one of the people that voted for this, if you ever see how quickly a floor deteriorates with a fire underneath it, you would think very differently of using an I-joist in your house. Very quick. There are options right now. I know the RCAC, because of this requirement, is going to look at there's a product called Wire Hyzer. I just know this one. I know probably every I-joist manufacturer has one. Wire Hyzers is called Flak Jacket. It is available. Takes a couple of days to get. I just checked with my supplier. If you use it, you do not have to do drywall on your ceiling. It adds roughly $3 to $3 a lineal foot to the cost of the I-joist. So if you're going to spend 40 to 50 cents square foot to just put up a piece of drywall, maybe you're doing it cheaper than that, but you know, it may be cheaper to do that. But there are options. That option may come down later on as it becomes more readily available. But it's I think it's going to be kind of like the door between your house and your garage. You can use a steel door or a solid wood door, or you can use a fire rated door, and the difference between them is a couple $100 because one has a tag on it, it's rated and all this kind of stuff, so somebody's taking a certain liability to do that. So it's just, there are going to be some options. I'm sure now that more states are using this requirement, that cost will probably come down. You're going to see more manufacturers. They'll be more readily available, so maybe it changes as time goes on. But we're just going to have to take a wait and see attitude of how you go about those changes in there. It's one of the code changes as me and the guys I work with on the code at the national level, and we've fought these things at the code change hearings. You don't like this, what was proposed was a lot worse. I mean, it was 5/8 drywall, it was taped and all kinds of different things. So just read over the section and see how you can get around it as you go through here. And as I said, I think the RCAC is going to make an interpretation as to what can be used as early as January of next year on this particular issue. So that might make it easier also as different interpretations and commentaries come through to tell you what you can use and can't use. So, questions?
What was that number again? 502 something? Or
502.14, I believe.
That's what we're doing.
Yeah, 502.14. Okay, that's it on floors. Walls. One thing, I don't believe many items have changed. There might be a few nailing patterns or whatever, but in table 602.3, parent 1, they've added the pneumatic nail equivalent to a 16 spike or a 6 common penny finish or something commons or whatever. So you're going to see that in just any table or when they tell you how to nail something. Just, I don't know that anybody gets that deep in depth in searching what you're doing, but in case somebody would, they're in the table, so you might want to just keep an eye on that. You're going to see in table 602.3, parent 5, where they talk about the maximum height of walls. There's some new pictures in there that make it a little easier to figure out what they're talking about, but the language did not change any. You're going to see a lot in wall construction on different things. They've added a lot more documentation and a lot more pictures to make it easier to understand what they're coming through. In my opinion, chapter 602.10 wall bracing is the biggest change in this code. and this has to do with wall bracing. We adopted the 2012 version of this code language. They started changing around wall bracing after a number of hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, all the different things together. A group of engineers, probably about as many as there are in this room, got together and started to create what wall bracing should be. They came up with the first draft, and it was approved in the 2009 version of the code. Very confusing, some new terms. You're going to see a lot of terms like braced wall panel and braced wall line that are going to be enforced. Some of those terms were in our previous codes, but nobody ever really looked at them. They are in there now. I'm not going to try to go through this because it's 23 pages of how to brace a wall, how to build it, how to fit it together, and it's just not enough time. It's actually, if you take the time to read it, what they did from the 9 version to the 12 version is just reorganize it to make it easier to understand. In the 2009 version, they were talking about one thing, then they jumped to another thing, and then a third thing, and then they go back to the first thing they were talking about. And it wasn't in a logical step. If you were going to design a wall to put the bracing in there, it just jumped all around. They changed all that. They added some additional pictures that were confusing. So they've done a fairly decent job with it. In reality, some of the language isn't a whole lot different that was in the 2003 version, but once again, it's elaborated more. The intent is a little bit easier to figure out. I'd probably recommend you picking up this book from the ICC. This is the book that basically tells you how to do those 23 pages of stuff. It's written in very good language, a lot of pictures, just shows you what they're trying to do. And the other thing that kind of goes hand in hand in here, and when I see some of these pictures, is there's 8 different kinds of construction that you can brace your walls. And you're going to get some new terms. There's LIB, let-in bracing, DWB, diagonal wood boards, WSP, wood structural panels, BVWSP, which is wood structural panels with stone or masonry veneer. There's SFB, structural fiberboard sheathing, GB, gypsum board, PBS, particle board sheathing, PCP, Portland cement plaster, HPS, hardboard panel siding, and ABW, alternative braced panel. No, alternative braced wall. So there's a lot of different construction methods in here, and they part of those 23 pages, there's a different way to do each one of those different methods of construction. Unlike what the past code interpretations or way it was literally read, you can put one wall construction or one type of sheathing on one wall, a different type of building sheath wall on this wall, and a third or fourth one. That they don't all have to be the same type of material. It's like if you started down wood structural panel OSB on the outside, you didn't have to do the whole house that way. If you got one area that you just can't make work and you want to use insulated sheathing on the house, you can do that. And this kind of comes hand in hand because now with energy efficiency, you're having to put more insulation in a wall, and there's a way to do that with using some type of foam insulation on the outside of your house. But that makes it more difficult sometimes to meet your wall bracing requirements. So you can intermix systems. The chapter, I don't know how many I used to know or wrote it down one time. On 60210, it really increased, or chapter 6 just exponentially increased. But they also added, if anybody wants to get back into framing houses with steel, there's 75 pages on how to frame a house with steel. That's all in there. If you use insulated concrete forms, there's 70 pages on how to build a house with insulated concrete forms, ICFs. Part of the and then one more. There's SIP, structural insulated panels. There's 9 pages on how to build it with that. So that's how some of that code book can grow sometimes, but it makes it easier for both builders and manufacturers to sell their product, or for builders to use that product if they want to. If it's in the code, it just takes a lot of less of the going to the code official saying, I want to do this, and they have to read it, they ask for more information, or your designer, whoever, you just got to jump through a lot more hoops. If it's in here, it's easier on everybody. But I don't know where it stops and starts, so. That's it on chapter 6. Chapter 7, exterior coverings. You're going to see new discussions on water-resistant barriers. It's exterior coverings. You're going to be a WRB, water-resistant barriers, water resistance. Where it used to be, we pretty much just put tar paper on the outside of every building, and that was in the code, and that's, if you did that, you didn't have to do anything. There's a lot, you basically had to have that before, but now they're specifically telling you what product to use where. They're giving you the option to use different products, your Tyvek, your Typars, your crinkle wrap, and all the different kind of things. And I know there's companies that have their own product and different things like that. So they're given more options on what you can use, but once again, it's something that's just new language interpreted in there. There may be different, people look at it differently. In these same coverings, you're going to see wind resistance take in there. They've done a lot more testing with, let's say you use vinyl siding over styrofoam siding. There's now requirements for that type of construction of how much wind the vinyl and the foam can take before it's blown out. And they've created these tests because of hurricanes and tornadoes and all those kind of things where vinyl's blowing off the house because it's moving too much, because the substrate behind it is moving too much. And they've done all kinds of different tests on that. So you're going to see, there's a section on there. If you just have to keep track of that as you go through. Chapter 8, most of the major changes have happened like before chapter 6. But chapter 8, attic access. And this is one of those chapters where I say there's little things like this that you don't think much of it, but it can jump out at you. If you've got an attic access in your house, there's your ceiling joist, your outside wall, and you've got a roof, and you put an attic access in here to get up. There's now a requirement for that dimension, that it can't get too small. It's 30 inches. So you can't just put it in an outside closet or something like that, possibly. Depending on your roof pitch and different things like that. But there's sometimes just little things like that that can kind of come back and get you a little bit. And try to get some of them, but there may be more of them in there that you just kind of see. Or once again, it's stuff that's always been in there that nobody really saw or looked at before. Flashing is one thing that is now written in the code and much more, I guess I'm going to say maybe prescriptive, or it's just labeled in there now. They actually have what they call sidewall flashing, which is, we sometimes refer as kick-out flashing. If you got like a dormer sticking out of a house and you have to actually have that flashing that goes up the side of the dormer kick out away from the construction, so it forces water away from the house. More specific, you're going to see per manufacturer's specs. You're just going to start to see more details on how to keep water away from the house. It's another type of the wind resistance, water resistance, moisture penetration. It's all kind of different issues that they've slowly incorporated into the code, because now the houses are getting tighter. There's been more mold or more moisture issues. We have the whole private ethos type of issues earlier a few years ago, and some of these issues and problems, the solutions are starting to work their way into the building code.
Is that in the 900s?
Yes. There's one in there I just see that I missed, I think. Yeah, 905.2.7.1, ice barrier. Some people may have been doing this already, but basically around all your eaves, all the way around the house, you now are required to have ice and water shield down there. I think some people weren't doing it at the time. By the old language, I still think we, because of our climate down here in the southern part of the state, our temperature didn't meet the requirements that what it was, but I was overruled. So the whole state is required to put ice and water shield on the bottom of the eaves. You know, I think every re-roofing job I've seen the guys do that, they're doing it all. Maybe everybody's incorporated that into their standard construction anymore, I don't know. But if you haven't, you're going to be required to. It's specifically written in there. There's no change with it. In fact, it's in, I don't know if I don't think I put that table in there.
Is it specifying how much, in other words, if you got a 3-foot overhang, does it still have to be like 2 feet within inside the heated wall?
It's 24 inches from the heated wall, so. And that's gonna be kind of an interesting thing. I mean, it's really, you know, if you had a porch that stuck out 5 feet, where does that, you know, interior wall, and this is where you hope that you can discuss this with your code official and say it's for where there's a condition, well, in areas where there has been a history of ice forming along the eaves causing backup of water as designated, okay. So you're gonna have water back up at the bottom. If you've got 5 feet of space between your inside wall, let's say on a covered patio, and the top, you don't have ice dams building up there. So you shouldn't put ice and water guards starting from that point there. So it may be, I don't know. It just never know how any of this stuff will kind of come and go, and it depends on inspectors and whatever, so.
Does that mean they're gonna start doing a roof inspection?
I have no idea. I mean, inspections are interesting. You see what's written in chapter 3, or is it chapter 4? I think it's chapter 1, what they can inspect. And talking with people across the state or across the country, what's inspected and what isn't inspected, when it's inspected, how it's inspected, it's completely different. And that's one thing that's still up to the building official. And that's one of those, if you argue too much, be careful what you wish for, because you might end up with more inspections than what you're really doing now. Chapter 11, energy efficiency. It is one that is, I'd say probably one of the main reasons that this code was delayed more than a year is probably this here. We spent a lot of time working on the energy efficiency part of the code. You have a number of options to use to do it. There's the International Energy Efficiency Code, the IECC 2009 version. There's chapters 11 of this code. Chapters 1101 through 1104, which is more of a prescriptive. That's basically an ICC version of our energy code. And then there's section 1105 of the, and it gives two options, what they call the Ohio Home Builders option, which is an option that we created. there's also, in some ways, a fourth option, but it's part of the IECC. It's called the performance option. I'll try to go through all these, but in my mind, over the years, not a whole lot of things have changed. I mean, you can still meet the requirements a lot of different ways. What it boils down to is you've got a box at your house, and the only thing that they're really changing, well, they're changing a lot, but it seems like a lot, but really what it comes down to is how much energy does that house use? How much energy escapes through the walls, through the ceiling, through windows, through doors, through holes in the ductwork, holes in the walls. They just keep requiring less and less energy that you can lose out of that house. Where it gets complicated is what you use to do that. As builders, we've always, for the most part, used the prescriptive table. And it just basically, you go in there and it's, the prescriptive tables are still in here. It tells you your wall has to have this, your ceiling has to have this, and everybody thinks it's real simple and easy to use. And it is very simple and easy to use. But because nobody really looks at that, what the people that write these codes have done is they make you pay a penalty for that because they figure nobody's looking at it. You may have missed a piece here, you may have missed a piece here, you didn't seal this window, your insulation in the attic isn't quite where it's supposed to be. So you pay a penalty, you put more in than what's really required. If for any of you that have been doing, and to a certain extent, a lot of us have used the Res Check program, which is just a step up about it. It gave you a little bit of options to change what you did. You could put a little bit more insulation in the ceiling to take care of walls or your basement walls. So you had some things in there. It's a step up. It's a step up from the prescriptive table. So it gave you some options. But in reality, you're going to pay somebody to do it, or you're going to pay people in your own company to do this if you use the performance option, which uses it's a software, I believe they're RemRate, RemDesign, those type of software, and they analyze the house for what they consider a standard house, and they compare that with your house to how much energy it's going to use, and then it's tested at the end to make sure it works. We've got a few raters in here, and there's maybe people that have done it in the past. I've used it. If you tried to get the energy credits, you're going to kind of basically, in a nutshell, without getting into, and I know my energy rater friends here will probably tell me that I'm skipping over it too quick, but in a nutshell, it's basically how much energy you use, and did you design your house and build it in such a way that it used less energy than what the code says you're supposed to use. But it gives you options to do that. I've been using it for a number of years, the HERS rating, just testing my houses just to see how it did. But in my opinion, what it really comes down to is keeping air from leaking into your house, both how you seal up the outside of the house and how you seal up your ductwork. We as builders have been screaming and yelling because it says, oh, you got to build your house with 2x6 walls now. You don't have to build your house with 2x6 walls. There's two options. Number one, you can design your house with how much air you think is going to leak out of it, and at the end of the project, you test it with a blower door test, and if you meet those requirements, you're fine. Or you can, the Ohio Home Builders prescriptive options, there's two options that we developed, one with an R15 in a 2x4 wall, and one with an R13 in a 2x4 wall. And I'll try to go over this just a little bit here in a few minutes. So there's two different options you can do, but you're going to pay a little bit of a penalty in there because if you use a prescriptive or Res Check software, they're assuming that your house is going to have 7 air changes per hour of leakage or less. With the two versions of the Ohio Home Builders, you have to test it One is 6, and I believe the other is 4 air changes per hour. So you have to look at those things a little bit closer, and you're given the option to use different materials because it's going to be tested to a different standard. So once again, somebody's looking at the process when it's all said and done. The simulated performance option, the way I look at it, is kind of somewhat eliminated from the Chapter 11 of the of our code, but it's in the ICC version of the energy code. So you can still use it one way or the other. Section 1102 is a building thermal envelope. That's where they give you the prescriptive. You can either use the R value or the U value. R value is what the insulation value of each component. The U value is the energy efficiency of an entire wall, including the walls, the studs, the windows, whatever you put in there, insulation in there. So prescriptive option is basically using those tables, R value. Total UA alternative is using the ResCheck software to kind of do it. And then there's a performance method that I send. Those are your 3 basic ways of going about the energy code. One thing that you're going to see, one of the little nitpicky type of things that you're going to have to do is now you're going to have to put a certificate on the electric panel that basically states what insulation you have in the walls, the ceilings, your furnace, all the different type of energy efficiency processes that you put in the house. I talked about increasing or decreasing, they're going to check air leakage. There's mandatory options in the code now, although they're not mandatory in the Chapter 11, but they're mandatory in the IECC version of the code. But there's mandatory parts on air leakage, mandatory on the system you use, mandatory on, there was one more, I think the duct systems that you use in there. This is going to kind of be where we start to run into interpretation issues, because there's just, I mean, if you look in the 2009 IECC, it says mandatory. If you look in our language, it does not say mandatory. Doesn't mean you don't have to do it. So I'm not quite sure how all that's going to fit together. There are a few things in there as we go through this, but it lists out actual things that you need to do, inspect, and check as you go through the construction of your house. It lists where air barriers you're going to start to learn, if you haven't, about air barriers and how to block off air getting into your home. You're going to be required to put a programmable thermostat in. The ductwork that you put in attics is going to change. There's going to be testing required on it. Unless, if you put all of your ductwork in a conditioned space, thank you, you do not have to do duct testing or anything like that. But if you put it in the attic, whatever, you're going to have to do some duct testing. I'll try to go through that a little bit here. I haven't quite figured out the best way to kind of go through some of this stuff, jump back and forth a little bit. But be just caution on the duct testing, but air leakage is going to be a very, very big thing. You are not going to be able to pass the codes in the future if you don't do something with air leakage. And I personally feel it's not that bad. if you just do a very good caulk and seal package, which most of the insulators are doing today, you will have no problem passing a blower door test. I really, really feel that. If none of you have ever done a blower door test on your house, go out tomorrow, get somebody to do a blower door test on your house, because I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised of what you do, how your house turns out to. And from the blower door test, as we get into that, we didn't say that you had to specifically use a certain individual or whatever. It's just that the blower door that you're using, the person doing the test has to be certified to use that particular blower door equipment. So I know there's a number of heating and air conditioning people that are looking into that. There might be some insulators. I know there's some insulators that do it in town and stuff. So there's going to be, I think, as things go on, there's going to be multiple ways that you can go about doing it. Or you're going to be able to pay somebody to help you through the whole process. So it's just a matter of what you feel comfortable with and how you want to go about it, or what you want to be able to show your customers. As far as if we just kind of go through just some of the prescriptive items, and I believe there's a prescriptive table. Walt, did we put this on the website? This by Bob Gilbert?
Yes.
Okay. It's a nice little table that kind of just shows the different R values and whatever that you have to put in there. It's on the HBA's website, but Ohio still has 2 zones in it. Just there's about 8 or 10 counties right along the river, essentially, that are in Zone 4. There's a pretty big difference between Zone 4 and Zone 5. But for the most of the state, you're gonna, for walls, we're R13 in the walls in Zone 4. Here in Zone 5, you're gonna be either an R20 or you're gonna use 13 plus 5. So R13 in the wall and an inch of foam on the outside of the house to get your R5. And that would be a continuous. Now you can go to compliance path 1 of the OHB option, which is putting an R15 in the wall, or an R13 plus 3, or you can use compliance path 2, which is R13. If you use the IECC versions, essentially you're going to put R38 in the ceiling. If you use the Ohio, the OHB alternative, you're going to put R49 in your ceilings. Fenestration, you have to have a U factor in your windows in the IECC in the standard code version of 0.35. In OHBA, you're going to be 0.32. So you're paying a little bit of a penalty, let's say, to do some of those things. Basement R value in the IECC, you're going to put an R10 continuous from floor to ceiling, or you're going to put R13, you're going to frame up your wall and put R13 in there. If you use the OHB alternative, you're going to do 10 or 13, but it only has to be 4 feet down. And there are some foam products out there that come down 4 feet, and they meet the foam spread characteristics and that kind of stuff. So once again, you're putting more insulation in other places, but you're putting less in a basement. So there's just different ways to go about it. Building air leakage in the IECC, there's 7 air changes per hour that you're required, and you can either have that tested, that's optional, or you can have a visual inspection of it to meet, to check the building air leakage. In the first compliance path, let's say the R15 wall version, you're going to have to go to 6 air changes per hour. And in the second R13, again, 6 air changes per hour, but you're going to have that house tested to be sure that it meets the requirements. Now that testing rule takes in effect January 1 of 2014. So the code gives you a year to figure out how to do this stuff. no matter what option you use, you're gonna put a programmable thermostat in. And they even tell you that you're supposed to set it at 70 for cooling and 78 for, or no, reverse, yeah. For heating, you can't be any higher than 70 and no lower than 78 for cooling, and you're supposed to program that in there when you build the house. I don't know. Of course, I know I built for people that don't know how to do it, so maybe that's why they do that. I don't know. But to think that nobody's ever going to change that. But anyway, duct insulation. It's all R8. Or all supplies are R8. Returns are R6. And that's if it's outside the thermal envelope. There isn't a change in, I think that's everything, okay. At one time there was both of them were gonna be R8. If the new requirement that will be for everybody, no matter which one you use, is the duct work. If it's, once again, if it's outside a conditioned space, you will test your duct work. And there's two ways you can do it. You can do it post-construction or at a rough-in test, and there's different requirements for either one, and they kind of specifically for each one what you have to do and when you have to do it. But if you use the ICC version for duct testing post-construction, it's 8 CFM leakage. If you use the R13 version, it's 6. If you use the R13 version, it's 4 air change or CFMs per square foot of conditioned space. So there's these calculations that you have to do to meet after that's tested. Now, similar situation if you do a rough-in test of how many CFMs you can lose during the whole process. It's just, there's about 4 or 5 different options in there. I'm not going to kind of go through there, but it's the ICC version, what's in the code, is going to be less stringent than if you do one of the OHB alternatives. Once again, there's the penalty for paying for possibly changing those walls. Lighting, 50% of it has to be high efficiency lighting. In the OHB alternatives, it's 75% of it has to be CFLs or LEDs or whatever. Once again, you know, these are pretty much prescriptive requirements no matter what you do. But if you choose to use different software, test it, you might be able to do something completely different. I mean, this is clear at the other end of the spectrum, but if you really seal up your building really, really tight, you just keep lower and lower the amount of insulation that you need to put in the house. It's pretty simple. I said it's a box, and there's only so much energy that can escape out of there. It's just a matter of which way you want to go about keeping that heat cooling inside that house. So there's a lot of different options. I say out of anything, I've heard more screaming and yelling from builders about this option, but it's just because it's different. And you really just have to look at it. And I think if you really, really look at it, yeah, I'm not saying that you're not going to be doing more than what you've done in the past, but there are many different ways to go about it, and you don't have to feel like anything's slammed down your neck like that you have to build a 2x6 wall. And don't let anybody tell you that you have to build a 2x6 wall. So.
Is ventilation addressed if you spray foam directly underneath the roof deck? In this version? I'm not an expert on spray foam. And spray foam, then if you use that directly to the roof deck, then you've created a conditioned space in your attic, so then you can put your ductwork up there and stuff. I don't know enough about spray foam, and I've also heard some things that scare me about spray foam. There's just a lot of stuff going on right now in the industry. A lot of people got into it, and I just don't think everybody has the expertise to use spray foam in the way that they should. And if I was a builder going to use spray foam, I would make very certain that whoever you're using to put that spray foam in there really understands what they're doing. So, is that, okay. I don't know if I got spray foam people in here, they're gonna get on me, but that kind of goes with any product that you're putting in your house today. But if you're using new products, as these newer products come in, you really have to be concerned. If you've never used insulated sheathing on the outside of your house before, really look at that. I mean, I've been using it since the 70s, so I feel very comfortable using it. But, you know, it changes your wall bracing, it changes a lot of different things. So, with energy efficiency, probably one of the biggest things, you feel, oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, but there's that law of unintended consequences, and be very certain what you're doing, how you're doing about it. When you start tightening up your house, you get these 3, 2, 3, 4 air changes per hour. You need to be cognizant of the fact that that house is very, very tight now. So, in fact, you know, you've got a flue for a fireplace or water heater, and the furnace comes on, it blows all your pilot down and different things like that. There's just all kinds of things like that that are taking effect, and the changes in energy efficiency are happening very, 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 very quickly. And there's some people that want them to happen even faster than what they are. But for my family, I know there's a lot of other people that have been in this business a long time. We've seen the latest, greatest product over the years, and then, you know, 6 months later, you're getting sued for it. One of my favorite Far Side, where the guy, I can't remember what his name, but he had Far Side cartoon. He had this guy sitting there reading the morning paper, and on the front copy it said, "Wheat Bran, the silent killer." It's just kind of that, you know, this is the greatest stuff where you eat wheat bran every day and you'll live forever. Well, then it comes, you know, and you see that in our industry, that there's this thing that was the greatest thing in the world, and, you know, now they don't even make it anymore, or, you know, whatever. So, and I'm not going to try to go into any products, but we've all probably used a product that we wish that we never would have put in one of our houses before. Couple other things on Chapter 11, and then I'll take more questions if there are some. Pools, there's some requirements if you do put pools in, for pool heaters, switches, covering the pools, and what have you. So keep in mind there, but that's kind of an interesting scenario because there really is no requirement for pools in the code. There used to be an addendum for pools. So I know I heard a couple of code officials say, how are we going to build pools? But pools have to have electric and everything go to them. So keep in mind that there may not be a requirement for the pool, but there's all the electric that goes in that and the bonding and everything like that. So how jurisdictions look at that, how they enforce it could be a little bit of a problem. So keep that in mind also. Any questions on energy? I know I kind of went through that very quickly, so.
Is there a requirement on the, you know, like, on the air exchanges? I know we've been doing Energy Star for a long time, and one of the things they wanted to do was, you know, to put a thermal bypass in to, you know, to bring inside or outside air, inside air exchange on, you know, combine the, you know, so you're not losing energy
Right.
doing it. But you're talking about getting down to the low air changes. Is there anything in there about the fresh air intake? Because it's always seemed, you know, we're sealing it all up, and we put a big hole in to bring fresh air in for the flow.
It's a good question, and I can't say that I have the perfect answer for it. But I will tell you this, and I don't have the standard in here, but it's an ASHRAE standard, which talks about heating. And ASHRAE is the American Society for Heating,
Air conditioning mechanical engineers.
Thank you. I never remember that one. But there's a standard for ventilation, and when your house gets so tight, what you're supposed to do. So, but it's not in the code language in this book, but it's going to be referenced back here in what they call standards. It's chapter, here it is.
62.2 is the ASHRAE.
Yeah, but it's chapter, oh, I don't know, but it's way in the back there, reference standards. There's a whole chapter on it. There's hundreds of them in here. 43. There's hundreds of them in there. But just because it's not in there, that standards is referenced, and that could come back and get you again. And that's where I say, be careful what you're doing. That's where I'd advise talking with someone who really understands the whole process, whether it be your HVAC guy, whether it be over here we've got some energy raters. Just understand what you're getting into when you get into this. It's complicated stuff if you get really, really down to the nitty gritty, and that's what you have to be careful of. So, question?
Yeah, one thing I might want to mention is on the plans, the builder has to decide which path he's going.
Yes. You pretty much have to tell the code official at the beginning of the process which way you're going. You can't kind of pick and choose in the middle, because there could to be some things that they should have inspected beforehand or checked or whatever. So just keep that in mind. It's been a little different in the past. You just kind of did whatever you want to whenever, but they've kind of specifically asked for what you're doing at the beginning. So.
A little context for you on the air changes an hour, just because you threw out what the numbers were. The Department of Energy says anything that is 3.5 air changes an hour or less is considered to be a tight house. So I mean that's still quite a bit of leakage that they're permitting.
Yeah.
With the new standard. So,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. It's very easy. I don't even try to remember all these things because there's just so much of it. And as much work as I've done with the code, I don't try to think that I know everything, and you have to be, it's very easy. You might think that's 4, or you might think it's 3.5 or whatever it is, but if you're thinking in your mind it's going to be one thing, and then you get down to the end and you have an issue and you're caught on it, you know, it can be problematic. It's easy to fix during construction. Let's say air leakage, you know, you got a duct issue. If you miss something, you think you're going to go one way and you think you're fine, and then you miss it later on. It's a lot harder to fix a leaking duct issue at the end of the line versus at the beginning of the line. So. One thing, when I did the presentation in Lima, one more thing on chapter 11, they asked if you're renovating a house, and maybe I already said this, but your addition, what energy code do you use for the addition? And there's 2 options. No, in the IECC, I'm sorry, the 2009 IECC, in chapter 1 of the administration, it tells you that only the addition has to meet the requirements of the new code. And that can be just the prescriptive requirements of it. You don't have to incorporate the whole house. You don't have to do that. So, and you don't, I'll just read it, it might be easier. Additions, alterations, renovations, or repairs to an existing building, building system, or portion thereof shall conform to the provisions of this code as they relate to new construction, without requiring the unaltered portions of the existing building or building system to comply with this code. In addition, shall be deemed to comply with this code if the addition alone complies, or if the existing building and addition comply with the code as a single building. So you can do it either way. I've had some additions I've added on fairly new houses, and I just incorporated them into the whole house and was able to get the energy code to work. But if you're building addition on a 1960s era house and they've never updated anything, you're not going to get that thing to work. You're just going to have to do the prescriptive requirement of the code and you're good. So that was a question that came up. So, any further questions on chapter 11? Couple of things, chapter 15, exhaust systems, dryer vents. If your dryer vent exceeds 25 feet, you're required to mark it somewhere within, I think, 6 feet of that, 6 feet of that dryer vent, that your dryer vent is over 25 feet. So I guess, I'm not going to tell you how many hours we argued over this at code hearings, but they've also have a table now that we're all used to. You use 4-inch dryer vent. If you've got a 45-degree elbow on it, it costs you 2.5 feet, and if it's a 90, it's 5 feet. Well, they have now a 6-inch radius, an 8-inch radius, and a 10-inch radius. So they're making different radius pipe for a dryer vent. So if you use a 10-inch radius for a 90-degree elbow, it only uses 1 foot 6 inches, 18 inches of you only lose 18 inches of that total space. So you gain 3.5 feet. So there's some different alternatives in here. That you can get longer distances out of your dryer vent, but you do have to label it if it's over 25 feet, because and part of the reason for that is because 25 feet has been in there for a very, very long time, and although it was increased to 30 for a while, but now it's back to 25. So the theory is that if you buy a house, you're going to assume that it's got 25 feet of space in there, and not 40 or 50 or whatever that you might have to do. Buy a dryer that's going to have a better motor or blower on it to blow at different distances and stuff. That's what the idea behind that 25 marking it was, which is better than marking every dryer vent for however long it was, which was where we started at. Yes.
Did you skip 14 and it was referenced some in 11? I thought you'd stop by it. On heating and cooling equipment though, the sizing requirement, when are we gonna check the sizing requirement? A plan approval, or which energy code you go by, or?
I did forget everything in chapter 14. Yes, there are.
Well, because there's more to that.
Yeah.
Than originally meets the eye, because everybody knows what manual J and everybody's heard of manual J's and the load calculation and so on. The manual S is a totally different animal.
Thank you.
And how close were the builders in the group, though? I mean, that means your sizing. The thing that you ever thought of, well, this was one size and we'll put in whatever we want, that won't work. And everything's going to be a lot smaller than it used to be, real fast. You go S.
Here's
lot smaller equipment.
In a nutshell, I'll give you this because thank you very much. It's one of those details that you're always supposed to size your equipment correctly. It was kind of written that way in the code. Now it specifically says that you've got to use, it's D, S, and J, correct? I think all 3 of them are mentioned.
D's not referenced that part, that's the duct, D's the duct design manual, but
yeah.
Okay.
So, but basically it's telling you, and I would not be surprised down the line possibly if you're required to put those calculations in with your plans somewhere along the line. Maybe it depends once again how the chief building official decides to enforce that. In Montgomery County, they're big on truss drawings, at the beginning of the process, whereas everybody else, the truss drawings can be there when you do your framing inspection. So there's going to be a lot of different maybe interpretations of that, but be cognizant of that. And that's kind of a reaction to the tighter energy codes and all these kind of different things that you're dealing with, is they've tried to make sure that all this stuff is coordinated, because you can't just do a ballpark type of house got so many CFM in it, I'm going to have so many returns, so many supplies, and they've changed all that. You're going to really have to start to figure some of those out and actually list it on paper and look at it. And Tom brings up a good point, is your equipment may look different, but I know a builder, I don't remember where he is, but one of the guys across the country, 2 houses side by side, about the same square feet. He designed his house, got it all worked, everything was exactly what it was required to be per manual, the manuals. The guy next door had a different builder built his house, had this huge air conditioner on the outside of the house. His was a little dinky thing. He got sued because he didn't use a big enough air conditioner in there, even though the house was heating and cooling right. He ended up just putting the same size air conditioner as the guy next door had to get out of this lawsuit. But it's not going to work correctly. I mean, anybody in here who's doing that, the size has nothing to do with anything. It's got to be designed correctly to do what it needs to do. There's a lot of problems in the heating and air conditioning because they aren't sized correctly, and you're just going to have to be very cognizant of that, because it very well could be that that's going to be required somewhere along the design process or the building process. So, thank you. I will add that to my notes. So.
Yeah, Jim, one reason I bring that up, on manual S, you can't be oversized with more than 5%. When you get to smaller equipment, on 2.5 ton units, I mean, you can be undersized by 15, but nothing can be over by 5, heat or cool. So houses where potentially you might have 3-ton air conditioners before, when you do this, you might have 2-ton air conditioners. And for a track builder, just like your other thing, I built 10 of Model A.
Yeah.
And the next person next year, they get this different unit that looks different. That's hard to say that the code says I have to put an undersized air conditioner in for you. And then hopefully the builders deal with that and don't refer that to the heating contract. That's what that manual S does say, though. I mean, it doesn't allow you to oversize by any means.
Okay, thank you. See, we're in 15. This is one of those little idiosyncrasies that, once again, I lost. 1502.4.6. If you don't have a dryer in the house, but you got a vent there, you got to put a cap on it. Now, I'm not sure if that's going to be, so every house you build, you put a cap on it, even though that you know that people's going to put a dryer in there. But, I mean, how many people built houses recently that they didn't put a dryer in there? But it was, some other people on my committee thought differently. The other issue on kind of all related to exhaust duct protection required. Now dryer vents are going to have the same type of requirements for metal plates over them as plumbing, copper water lines, any kind of water line or plastic vents that you use. So you're putting the metal plates where they go through studs and that type of thing. Might be just a little thing, but it mainly is going to be for people who use the really large ovens or ranges and put the large hoods in them. You may have to have makeup air in those. Once again, we're talking about the fresh air supply and type in the house, so that there's, just like you do a combustion air for a fireplace, you're going to have some kind of air to make up that thing that's pulling X amount of CFM. I'm sure you've put 1 or 2 of those in, Steve. So, I'm just going to say this because I've heard this, that people say that you can't put, 2 things that I've heard, and I don't think they're necessarily correct, but one is that you can't put a furnace in a garage anymore. But the real issue is that furnaces and air handling systems that supply air to living spaces shall not supply air to or return air from a garage. I think people kind of misconstrue that, because that you can't put anything, or the one that comes through a garage. It's more, you just can't have ductwork going into and out of the garage, which really has been that way for quite a while, but it's just specifically located in there. The other thing that I've heard people say that you can't have heating systems in slabs anymore. And it really is that there was a system of designing where you had a crawl space and you put a hole in the floor and you put your downdraft furnace in that and you force the air into the crawl space, and then you put registers all around the house, and the air blew it and it went up through the house and it heated your house. That's what you can't do anymore. So, but people take that to say that you can't put crawl space or slab heating in anymore. So now I'm not saying that, you know, when you go into the duct testing and all those kind of things that you're going to have to keep that in mind also. But Chapter 17 used to be a separate section on combustion air. They've actually basically moved the whole thing to the fuel gas code, which it was already in there to begin with. Now it's, instead of having it in there twice, it's just in a different location. Most of the requirements are identical. If any have changed at all, I'm not aware of it. I don't know how many, in chimneys and vents, Chapter 18, there's an Ohio provision that was added. It says for chimneys and vents, you're not allowed to put portable unvented heaters in locations otherwise. You're not allowed to put a portable unvented heater in your house. I don't know of too many people that are doing that when they build a house, but it's in the building code. So why they had to do that, I don't know. Auxiliary drain, this is in, I jumped to chapter 24. Chapter 24, auxiliary drain pans. You're going to have some, if you put furnaces in a second floor, they're going to have a drain pan under them, and they give prescriptive requirements for where that drain drains to. For anybody using the CSST, the corrugated stainless steel tubing, they've added specific requirements for that now in Chapter 24 as to exactly how it's bonded, where it's bonded. Basically use whatever your manufacturer tells you to use, but it's been a very controversial type of product over the last couple of years. There's been some questions and problems with it. So there's actually language in the code, so once again, it's going to be a point that people might look at more closely than they did in the past. 2415 piping systems. If you had multiple units, you aren't allowed to use like one gas main that goes down the middle of the building and supply gas to each of the separate units. Each gas line has to be independent to each one of those units. That's probably only people that are doing multifamily type of construction. But you can't have a gas line pass from one unit to another unit if they're separate residences. And then, I don't think anybody's doing this anymore either, but gas piping shall enter and exit a building above grade. And in the old days, we pumped it underneath there, but I don't know that's even happening anymore. But it may be something, if you're doing a remodeling job or something, that may come and get you. Chapter 25, plumbing systems. The only thing in here, just because I've heard this going back and forth, and I had about a month's worth of discussions with Montgomery County, and I finally won, but there is no shower liner test required in the building code. They have no authority to enforce a shower liner test. So it does state that it kind of gives some prescriptive requirements of what a shower liner should be, but there is nothing in there that states that if you do let's say a no-step shower in your house, that it has to have a test on it where 2 inches of water above the high points and sits for X amount of hours or whatever. That has been removed from the code. It was never in the last code. I know a lot of different jurisdictions have been enforcing that and trying to. Montgomery County went all the way to a lot of different things. Their legal people talked with a lot of legal people, and they realized that the plumbing code is now controlled by the RCAC for residential construction. The local plumbing authorities have no control over it, and it was a hard thing for the people to admit, but they finally said that I wore them down, is their terms. But they were pretty nasty to, maybe Steve knows who I'm talking about as far as the plumbers that do some of our work. And but anyway, that's basically the plumbing.
Threatened to jerk their license?
Yeah, they threatened to jerk their license, which is,
Pretty nasty. All
yeah.
because of you, Jim.
I know.
You're an asshole.
Leave it to you to point that out. Moving on here, water supply distribution, chapter 29. For anybody who would want to do a sprinkler system inside their house, a fire protection system in there, chapter 29 of the code now gives you a prescriptive way of doing that. So if you wanted to just, let's say, instead of doing drywall on your ceiling in a basement, you could put a sprinkler system down there. And it might be a cheaper way to do it. There's prescriptive ways so that your plumber can run this. You don't have to get a fire specialist to install that system in there. You can use the existing water system. You don't have to do a different system in there. So chapter 29 gives you a whole way of going about that. It's not the easiest thing to read, but it is in there, so it'd be something to look into. Chapter 34, electrical requirements. There was 2 electrical requirements that were eliminated by the RCAC from the National Electric Code. First one is section 210.8, parent A, parent 2. The garage door opener outlet that you have in the ceiling does not have to be GFI protected. Nor in 210.8, parent A, parent 5, the receptacle for the sump pump does not have to be GFI protected in your basement. So, I think that's everything there. In closing, before we get to, and if there's any more questions or thoughts, I recommend that you buy a code book. It's amazing how many people do this for a living and don't have a code book. I'd recommend buying the commentary for it because that has saved me many, many times, both before and after issues. If the wall bracing is a little confusing to you, I'd recommend looking at the wall bracing book from the ICC. Just a couple other points of thoughts. Take it easy on the inspectors because they're in the same boat that we are. For whatever reason, these code books weren't available till the middle of November. That's when they first were able to see them also. They're trying to learn all this stuff just like we are. The state is working on publishing just like webinars like they did for chapter 3, but their next one isn't until February. It might be on chapter 4, and it might be another month, it's chapter 5 and chapter 6. It might be the end of the year before there's standard training for the whole state for all these different things. I've always found it much better to know the code, know what's going on. If you have a problem, look for the section. If you don't know what section it is and you get turned down for an inspection, ask the inspector what section it is, what you're getting turned down through. Look in the book, read it over, try to interpret it, come up with an answer, before he just starts screaming and yelling at you. You'll have much better luck working the problem out with the inspector if you know what you're talking about, they respect you, and it just makes it a little bit easier. If that's, I've hoped I helped you out a lot, and if you got any ways I can make this better if I keep doing this, just let me know later on, and I'll take any other questions.
One of the things that they dropped out of the code book was the unreinforced concrete walls, foundation walls.
Mm-hmm.
The way it's in the book now is only reinforced walls. Kind of skipped over that, which I'm sure that a lot of these builders are going to catch on.
Well, that again kind of comes into that chapter. I can specifically mention that, but chapter ACI 318, that's kind of where those things to come into, and you look through there, those tables, those concrete wall tables are come strict right out of the concrete standards.
Right.
So they changed them, the ICC changes them in here, and like you say, they eliminated those kind of things, so.
So you don't have a choice now, the way I've been told.
No, you've got a choice. If you can get a designer or an engineer that says that's fine, there's nothing they can do about it.
Prescriptive method is what's in that book.
Prescriptive method. It just kind of, as I said, with this code is basically, I kind of mentioned it with energy code. It's assuming that nobody's checking over, doing whatever you're doing. So it's going to be more restrictive all the way through. Wall break, foundation walls, whatever. If you want to do something different, and if you get somebody, a designer or whatever, that's going to sign off, an engineer, you can do whatever you want, whether it's right or wrong or indifferent. But if it's sealed, has somebody's license saying that you can do this or that, the code official cannot do anything about it. So they can't require that either. So.
The 23 pages of bracing for the walls, is that gonna also, I mean, is that during construction? Or is that? Okay.
Is that what you meant? Like?
No, I was just saying if you're erecting walls and so forth.
No, it's the finished wall, what it looks like when they come to frame at the final at the rough framing inspection.
Okay. And if you're doing a project like this in another state, will this code, is it?
If you go to virtually every state surrounding us right now, they're all using some version of the IRC, the I codes, and it's going to be relatively the same. So, one thing and part of that 23 pages now is we've all seen it before, but you know, you got 12 inches on each side of a garage door, and that thing. I mean, there's a way to do that, and it's specified in the building code how to do that. That's part of that 23 pages. So, and there's a way to do it if you only have 18 inches and 24 inches, and the minimum is 3 feet 4 inches, I think. So there's ways that you can go about it that are prescriptively put in there. Some of it are, you know, it's just the way it is. So that's part of what's going on in there. You're just given more options that are in the code that you don't have to get code officials' approval, show them all the paperwork, get the manufacturer to tell you, and those type of things. So. You're speechless, I can tell.
I do have a question back to the poured concrete walls. Basically, the gentleman was saying that the unreinforced is no longer in there. Is there a prescriptive table that says how much steel you have to put in, like before they
Yes.
the wall?
Yes.
And is that, just help me out without having to look here. Is that like a full mat? Is it a couple pieces top and bottom?
It depends. I mean, it depends on what your soil conditions are, how tall the wall is, how thick the wall is, all that kind of stuff, and it gives you, specifics, how many bars that you have to have, where they've got to be, and those type of things. So there's also horizontal and vertical requirements, so keep that in mind also. So, in my learning about some of this, sometimes the vertical is more important than the horizontal, so believe it or not, it doesn't, to me, make sense, but I'm not an engineer and never claimed to be, but I've learned a lot of engineering over the years, so. Thank you very much. You guys have a great evening.
Where's,
Thanks for your call.